Hello, good evening. Wow, how am I going to speak after this? I'm just so proud of them. They did amazing. Okay, turn to someone next to you and share a God story. A small testimony, something that happened to you, and you were like, okay, that was definitely God. Just don't talk too much. I'm going to give you 3 minutes. Okay? Start. Okay. I hope this was enough time for you to share at least a small story. Well, it was August 4th, 2023, and I was traveling to the capital of Brazil, Brasilia, to apply once again for a visa, this time to attend a Bible school in the US for 9 months. I was surprised that I was able to schedule my interview 2 weeks in advance, especially considering that some of my friends took months to schedule theirs. But at the same time, I was nervous. Honestly, my profile was not the most attractive one for this visa. I was young, single, without a stable job for years, and if someone asked me if I had all the money to pay for the entire school at that moment, my most honest answer would be no. The odds did not seem be on my favor. My dad and I left home early, probably 4 hours before my first appointment that morning. But the traffic didn't seem to help. The plan was to arrive an hour early, and with luck, I would be at least 10 minutes late. We finally arrived at the place, and I simply opened the car door, jumped out, and ran into the building while my dad was looking for a parking spot. But when I look around, I see that in addition to being late, I now have another problem. I forgot the folder with all my documents inside the car. I started calling my dad desperately, hoping he will come back so I can finally get in, and he doesn't answer for the next 20 minutes. By now, I'm almost half an hour late, and I'm scared that I'm gonna miss my trip, the chance to apply for the visa and for the school. After a few minutes, he arrives carrying the folder. I rushed out, entered the place, and no one actually checks the time I was scheduled for. Ooh, looks like I was lucky. Well, okay, they check the documents, everything is in order. I move on to the next and most feared step, the interview. That's where they would ask me a lot of questions, check if I had the means to stay in the country, if I had intentions of staying there illegally. I waited to be called for the interview for at least 2 hours. The place was completely crowded and chaotic that day. Until someone called me to get in line. Amen. And when that finally happened, we received the news. The system was having problems, and they wouldn't be able to continue with the interviews that day. My expectations are just broken. If I don't get the visa today, I probably won't be able to get to the school that starts in a few weeks. Until the boss of the place points to the family behind me and says, "You and those in front of you are the last ones in line for the interview today. Those in the back can just leave." Even with all the odds against me, I would be interviewed that day after all. Wow. It seems I got lucky again. The interview begins and I remain nervous. She asked me a lot of questions about my family, my intentions, my school, and I continue to answer in a way that seems to please her enough. Until she asked me something that stops me cold. "What do you intend to do when the school ends?" I just answer with the first thing that comes to my mind, "Well, leave the country." But she insists, "Okay, but when you leave the country, what comes next?" I don't know. I wanted to say, "Girl, I've had this debate with God so many times, and he insisted on directing me no more than 2 months in advance." Until I feel something, as if someone were giving me the answer, saying to me, Don't you want to be a missionary sent by your church? Tell her that you're going to work with your church. I say that, and it seems to be enough. She doesn't ask me for more financial proof, for any more details. My visa has been approved. I leave the room still trying to understand what happened that day. These visas have been so difficult to approve that when I tell the news to one of my future staff, she literally cries with me. That was it. Despite all the odds, everything had been aligned in the smallest details that day. Was I really that lucky? Were some of you just lucky, after all? I mean, God didn't appear in a physically and very miraculous way in many of the stories that we share as God stories. So how do we know it was Him? Some of my friends may try to explain this using the energies of the universe. Maybe that day, driving to my visa appointment, the stars just aligned. Maybe everything was just a big coincidence. I was in the right place at the right time. But not for us. Us believers, we have a different view. We walk in the certainty of things that we cannot see, right? And we know a God that is sovereign over all circumstances and all occasions. A God who floods the whole earth, plagues Egypt, parts the Red Sea, but who, out of love for His people, also works in the shadows and behind the scenes. And this is exactly what the book of Esther is about. In this book, no big miracles happens, at least not in the purest meaning of the word. But we still see Yahweh's sovereignty and faithfulness to His people in the smallest coincidences of an everyday life in a pagan land. Something so close to our reality, right? In the only book of the Bible that doesn't mention the name of God, we see that the absence of His name does not mean the absence of His presence. If you don't remember the original story of Esther, I mean, this was a good reminder, but if you don't remember, I'm gonna just give you a brief summary. The story takes place in Persia during the reign of Ahasuerus. At the beginning of his reign, he dethrones Queen Vashti because of an argument that they had, and he starts a hardcore beauty pageant to find a new queen. Esther, our protagonist, is one of the virgins taken into the palace. And she ends up winning the king's favor while hiding her Jewish identity. She's crowned a queen, and everything seems to be going super well until Mordecai, her cousin and kind of adopted father, decides to not bow down to one of the most important officials in Persia, Haman. And this, of course, causes Haman's anger. And he decides that the solution is to kill not only Mordecai, but the entire Jewish people living in Persia. He then issues a decree throughout the whole reign, and all seems lost for the Jews. Until Esther accepts to risk her life, and with a lot of courage and wisdom, she intercedes for her people. The fate of the Jews in Persia is reversed. Haman is destroyed, and all those who dare to attack the Jews. The book ends with a big celebration, a feast called Purim, that celebrates this great reversal and this great deliverance that the Jews experienced in Persia. Well, what a beautiful story, right? But it sounds like we forgot someone. I mean, were the Jews just lucky? Where was God in all of this? The author of the book of Esther seems to purposefully withhold God's name and a direct mention of Him in this book, to get the reader to not only hear about God, but to experience Him and to look for His action throughout the whole story, in the shadows, behind the scenes, And it's everywhere. This book is full of reversals, irony, and humor, like you guys saw. But it's also full of weird coincidences. For me to show this a little bit better, of course, we need to talk about the historical background. Wow, every BCC student favorite part. So, for most scholars, this book was originally written for the Jews in diaspora. That is, the Jews that decided to stay in Persia, even after they were allowed to return to the Promised Land after the exile. These Jews, they had good reasons to stay in Persia. I mean, many of them were born there, and maybe Persia was everything that they knew. They had their homes, their families, maybe their business, and their things there. So, and also the Promised Land at that time didn't have much to offer, at least not at their eyes. I mean, Jerusalem had been destroyed, and the temple had been burned, and the Jews that decided to return after the decree that allowed them to return, they were facing a lot of opposition and oppression from the neighboring nations. We can understand the motivations that made them to stay in Persia. But at the same time, they were seen as lesser. They were seen as less of a Jew, and they were feeling like that. Probably many questions were surrounding their minds. Questions like, are we still God's people, even though we decided to not go back to the Promised Land? Can God and will God move in a pagan land in our favor? This book was written as a proof to them to show God remains sovereign, regardless the place. It doesn't matter. It's not about the Promised Land. God is sovereign in the Promised Land, and he's also sovereign in Persia. And he also remains absolutely faithful to his people, no matter the place, wherever they are. And researching about the original reader of this book, unfortunately, was like looking in a mirror for me. How many times I doubted God's action because I thought that somehow it depended on me. If I deserved it, if I had sinned little, and if I had done my quiet time properly in the past few weeks, if I needed God, he would definitely act. He would definitely move. I mean, I deserve it, right? But if I have failed my prayers in the past few days, I shouldn't expect anything. I don't deserve his move. And by doing that, I take my eyes off the grace of God, which was never about who we are or what we do. It was never about who the Jews were. It was always about who the Lord has been. The Jews in Persia, they did not deserve God's move, but neither those who went back to the Promised Land. I mean, isn't that what the Bible is showing us over and over and over again? The Jews' failures, human failures. But also at the same time, the absolute faithfulness of the Lord, even in the midst of human unfaithfulness. That's crazy. And in Persia, this would not be different. There's no limits for God's actions. There's no place he cannot access. There's no circumstance he cannot move in. And it's crazy how easily the Jews forget this. I mean, they grew up hearing stories about a God who plagued an entire nation to save their ancestors. And now they doubt that he can do the same for them. And also we grew up, many of us grew up hearing the same stories, in seeing God moving in our personal lives. But when the circumstances changes a little bit, we're like, I don't know if he can do it again. Not for me. But it's trusting in this absolute faithfulness of God that Mordecai says to Esther, one of the most famous verses of this book in chapter 4. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, "Do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Mordecai makes it clear that he knows that the question was never whether the Lord would stay faithful to them or not, if he was going to deliver the Jews or not. The question was more how he's going to do it, how he's going to do it this time. Is Esther going to choose to be part of this move? And that's it. But surely Mordecai knew that somehow deliverance was coming for the Jews, and the Lord was still sovereign and faithful, even in Persia. And I love the way that the Lord chose to move in such a unique way in this book and this story. According to the way this book is structured, sorry, BCC again, its main message is not in the final deliverance of the Jews. It's not in their victory against their enemies, but much more how this deliverance was built on much more ordinary events. In chapter 6, we saw the king could not sleep, something that you cannot control. He then decides to read a book talking about his own deeds, and by chance, he opens on a page that says that he didn't honor Mordecai for saving his life some time ago. So many coincidences for just one night, right? From that part on, the Jews' fortunes are reversed. Mordecai is honored, Haman's plan is revealed, and the destiny of the Jews is completely changed. No great miracle happened in this book. This time, God did not plague the whole nation. He didn't part any sea. But somehow, he showed that in the midst of the apparent absence, he's still sovereign over all circumstances, even the most ordinary ones. The book of Esther, I think, is a reminder for us that the Lord is still faithful. And his faithfulness does not change with human unfaithfulness. It has never been about us. And thank God for that. And it's also an invitation for us to see this faithfulness played out not only in the great miracles, but also in the most ordinary of life. Even in those moments where God don't seem to be really there. I'm currently going through a time that it's hard to believe that God is moving. But the challenge for me in this book and the challenge for you is to believe that even when we can see it, even when we can feel it, God is there. God is there. He's still moving. He's still working behind the scenes. He remains absolutely faithful. And sometimes all it takes is 2 seconds and something as ordinary as a night of insomnia for him to change everything upside down. Yeah, Lord, thank you. Thank you for this week with this amazing book. Thank you for reminding us once again that you were faithful. You're faithful to your promises. And yeah, we just ask that we're going to walk full of hope in this faithfulness, in your sovereignty, and knowing that even when we can't see it, even when we can feel it, we know that you're still working. We know that you're still working behind the scenes. Yeah, thank you so much for tonight. In your name, I pray. Amen.
Thanks. Thanks, Isa.